We will now be turning to the culmination point of our webinar, which is the third session in the first audio sequence, which will be on the topic of financing mechanisms. Please once again remember to provide us with questions as they arise. The audio sequence will start now.
Hello. In the previous section, we talked a lot about the importance of financing instruments or financial mechanisms. And we had two aspects why financial mechanisms were important to us. This is transformational change and implementation readiness. Now what we haven't done, and we're going to do that now, is to talk about the financing mechanism as such, the types of financing mechanisms and the rationale of financing mechanisms. So, please, what can you tell us about financing mechanisms?
I'd like to answer the question, in fact, three questions. One is, who puts these financing mechanisms in place? Two is, who needs them? And three would be, where do we get the money from? And those that put these instruments in place would normally be the public sector. The public sector is usually regulating the economy with financing incentives or disincentives, and those are normally implemented through the tax system. So the public sector is already regulating through financing mechanisms. Now, obviously also those that are regulated by the public sector would typically be private investors. So the public sector is putting into place different financing incentives or disincentives in order to make the private sector invest in certain preferred investment alternatives. And in fact, what we are looking for is exactly the same thing. We would like to see financing instruments that are implemented by the public sector in order to promote the low emission investments. So, the private sector, the reason why, of course, it is the public sector putting this in place is that most of these investments that have emission externalities, you would call them normally, the emissions that are stemming from buying different kinds of equipment, those investments are in most cases done by the private sector. So it is, in fact, the private sector's investments that we are trying to influence through the public sector financing instruments. Now, where do we get the money from? Well, we at the NAMA facility is, of course, one source of financing. But we are not the only source. We are normally a temporary source that phases our support in, but we are in fact just as interested in seeing how can we phase our support out again, and how can that be that support be taken over by other sources. And as we're looking for permanent changes of investment behavior in the private sector, we would also be looking for permanent sources of finance. And that source would typically also be the public sector budget.
Well, depends, right? Not necessarily.
Not necessarily. But we do have, the instruments that are promoting certain investments, the public sector instruments that have this capacity of directing investments in a certain direction, are also the public sector instruments that would be able to raise the long-term financing. It may well be that those instruments that we are bringing in cannot immediately be taken over by the national public sector, so there would be a need for other sources of finance to face that different financing in. Let me give you an example, because it's also a question of who are we actually looking at to raise that kind of financing. Say, for instance, air conditioners for households. they have a certain energy efficiency. We would like to raise that efficiency to reduce energy consumption, but that would mean that the average price of air conditioners for households would go up. We, as a financing mechanism, could foresee, for instance, a temporary sweetener. We could, even though it's not the most cost-efficient way to do so, we could put in a small grant for that investment, and that grant would then phase out again until the household would get used to a different and higher price level for the investment. Mostly they would, in fact, earn extra investment back from savings. But we are now expecting the households to provide that financing, the long-term financing, simply by buying more expensive equipment. You could also see an option where the public sector could participate in that. There may well be a situation where these ACs are imported and the import tax on those would be 20% and applied across the board. But you could in fact reduce the import tax on the more efficient air conditioners and by that reduce the actual retail price. But in that case, the financing would have been provided by the public sector. And very often you would see those, a combination of those two sources as the optimal way in which you can establish financing.
Now, when we look at the NAMA support projects and what we being offered as financing mechanism in the offline, it's mostly not public sector instruments as depreciation rules or taxes or subsidies. It's mostly, it's concessional loans directly to the private sector, concessional loans, or even grants sometimes, or guarantees to the banks to lower the risk. So why is that so? Do you have any idea?
I'm afraid that in many cases, those that develop NAMAs are still having a more project-oriented approach. It's a temporary intervention of one or another kind. So a project approach fits well with a temporary mechanism that we put in with an NAMA facility in a bank, for instance, as a subsidy on interest rates, for instance, in a certain period of time, and then we're out again, and that was then the NAMA. And we would, in fact, very much like to see a more permanent change in the financing structure, where we see these public sector financing instruments also applied.
Yeah, that comes together with, say, all projects are named NAMA support projects. So NAMA support projects fitting into a wider NAMA and supporting a wider sector scheme. And this is actually what we're looking at.
Yes, hello, this is Søren David again, live from Berlin. Not surprisingly to us, we have received a high number of questions on this third audio sequence, which is really at the core of today's webinar. And I'd like to read out one of the questions we have received. It is a bit longer, but it seems fairly interesting to us. The explanation of the facility points to incremental finance need. However, we find that many NAMAs which are nationally driven do not always need incremental finance. They need access to capital in grants to lower equity or loans to cover the debt. The equity part can fit into incremental finance, but the loans often not. Søren, what would you respond to that?
Well, it sounds to me like it's both that some NAMAs need financing or do not need financing, but in the end they do anyway, just in a different form. I think first of all, the NAMA facility does not per definition fit into all contexts. When our offer is not, it's not a given that it matches the need that is presented. And many NAMAs, thank God for that, are actually being implemented without the participation neither of the NAMA facility nor any other external financing. They're happening on national budget or national initiative. What we believe that we can do, and we are trying, in fact, to make a work division here on the capital, that we participate in those cases where a public financial structure is the answer to make the private sector invest in low emission assets. Of course, that you could regard that then as being a limitation of the scope of the NAMA facility, in the sense that we do not participate in any context. We participate where our offer, which is a financial offer, fits that context, and we would like to see us participating on the public sector side simply from the belief that if we get the public sector driven framework conditions right, private sector's access to capital is sufficient to meet the demand.
Okay, thank you for that, Søren. We just now received a question which is rather short and only on first sight seems to be an easy one, and here it comes. The question is, do mechanisms have to be financial?
No, they do not. And many of the most efficient instruments are in fact not financial. They are regulations, and a lot of regulations are already in place. Everybody are familiar with regulation in the building sector and building codes that sets norms for the energy consumption of buildings. That's not financial. That's simply a rule and a regulation that companies would have to comply with. The challenge in that regard would be the enforcement of the regulation, which is often a challenge. But it's not a financial mechanism. In many cases, combining different instruments and combining financial and non-financial instruments are in fact the most efficient way forward.
Okay, thanks for that clear answer, Søren. Before we turn to our fourth audio sequence, I'd like to ask one last question, Søren, to you. Here comes. It sounds like you're only looking at public sector administered financing mechanisms. Are there no private sector mechanisms?
Yeah, just as I said, as my answer to the first question, we're trying to establish this work division where we are not so much participating in the private sector's financial structuring. We're taking that as a point of departure in the sense that, and we're coming back to that in the next session here, in the business models, we assume that the private sector would invest based on a business model which has to come together. Our task, or not our task alone, but the NAMA facilities participation in the entire structure would be where the public sector needs to put in place one or more instruments that makes the private sector's business model come together. So it's simply about making the low emission alternative the private sector's preferred investment option.
All right, thanks very much, Søren.